Today, I have Lorna Erickson with me. Lorna is the co founder of Expert Interviewers. So, welcome, Lorna.
Hey, thank you.
So, I'd love to hear your story about co founding Expert Interviewers and your research into the subject matter.
Yeah. So Expert Interviewers we started it in 2020. Um, and prior to that, though, I had started off in the recruiting realm right out of college, which was in 2006. I know I'm dating myself a little bit, but in 2006. And so I got thrown into the recruiting world just right out of the gates. And it was the kind of format where I was an agency recruiter. And so then we were working with clients, and it was a salesperson that was the middleman, right? And at that point, it was really interesting for me to learn, how do I try to identify candidates? And then you would throw these candidates at these hiring managers based on what the salesperson said that this person wanted. So this really weird game of telephone. And then mad respect to recruiters, because they're on the front lines to have to give the feedback or the lack of feedback or the bad feedback to the candidates in that process, right? So it was like trial by fire, a little bit of a gauntlet, which I know a lot of recruiters can relate to. But then we fast forward a few years, 3 or 4 years, and I started doing corporate recruiting. And all of a sudden, I had access to those hiring managers directly, right? I was able to partner with these people directly. And very quickly, I thought, aha, you are the problem. Like, this is an issue. And it was a fascinating way to learn a different side of the industry I'd already kind of been in. But I got a chance to sit with these hiring managers, shadow their interviews, listen to their questions, and then listen to their feedback as well. And over time, I started to notice that a lot of their feedback wasn't aligned with what they initially said they needed, or their questions weren't aligned with what they initially said that they needed. And then the last part there, that feedback piece, that wasn't aligned with what they initially said that they needed. And so after a little bit of time, I noticed that I kept pushing back and saying, this can't be your feedback. We can't have your feedback being non-job related things or things about protected characteristics. And so once I started to push back, then the questions were, okay, if I can't do that, then what can I do? And that's where I realized I needed answers. If I'm going to take people's gut feelings away from them or take their bad feedback away from them, I need to give them something else. And so I started studying interviewing, taking classes, reading books. And then I got to create a 7-year case study within this company and track the progress of all these new techniques. And so that's really how it started, was just based on the feedback, the lack of feedback, and the bad feedback. And that's kind of how it started, and getting my interest in interviewing and becoming obsessed with it like I am today.
So, if someone has been promoted recently into a manager or director seat, and maybe before was a individual contributor and now they are responsible for leading a team, part of being a leader is recruiting and interviewing for your department.
Right.
So, what do you suggest to someone who's a new manager?
Yeah. Well, first, I do think what's shocking to me is how few companies train their interviewers to interview. They're going to give them management training on whatever systems they're using, leadership, like whatever. There's a whole plethora of training that managers often get, but interviewing isn't one of them. And it's a huge risk. I mean, companies are spending hundreds of thousands of dollars in investments in people, and they're saying, get in there and use your gut. It's like, just go for it. And that to me is just shocking, right? And I think with intention, you can give your hiring leaders the information, the tools that they need to, one, feel confident. Nobody likes to go into something wondering if they're good at it, wondering if they're making a good impression on candidates. So you want to be able to give them the tools to be confident. And then, of course, you want them to have the tools to hire the right talent the first time, because that's going to help their teams, but also the company overall.
In my recruiting experience, I've seen so many times great candidates not be interested in a job or a company because they had a bad interview experience. And it
Right.
starts with the lack of training that the hiring manager has received.
Yeah. We talk a lot about the cost of a bad hire, but to your point, it's hard to put value on the great candidates who got away, right? That's the hardest piece to put value on. And it's something that companies and individuals, they need to be aware of, that it'll cost you. And then not to mention, of course, that candidate is going to voice their experiences about that company or that said manager um, in their markets, as well. So you could be hurting the rest of your candidate pool that way too.
Your referral pipeline is going to go to zero.
Right. Yeah. Negative word spreads a lot faster than positive word, unfortunately. So there's a lot of incentive to get it right.
And people do. They tell their friends, their families, they'll get on the internet and do a reel about their bad experience. And so I think the companies really need to be aware of the candidate experience and making sure it's a positive one.
Absolutely. Yep. Couldn't agree more. Yeah. You see the horror stories all over Instagram, TikTok, Glassdoor. There's lots of venues for that, for sure.
So, why is it crucial that candidates have a positive experience when interviewing?
Well, let's see. It's a preview, first of all, to what's going to be happening in the company. So if a set of interviewers come in and they're late, unprepared, not organized, or they ask you back for multiple rounds of interviews, immediately that candidate's going to be questioning, if you're doing this as a first impression to me, what is it going to be like when I'm actually inside the company? So it's about building the credibility and showing the candidates what's actually going on within your company. So the better you have that aligned to how you typically operate, then it's kind of like it's giving the candidates an idea of what to expect if they were to work for you.
I always talk about how recruiting is like dating. And so the interview experience is like the dating phase, and everyone's supposed to be on their best behavior at that point
Yeah.
before they make the commitment and make the hire.
Yeah. And so you see so much candidate advice out there of how can you make a positive first impression? How can you answer these questions correctly? But all of that advice should also be going toward the interviewer, right? It's like, how can you make a positive impression, right? How can you make sure that you're utilizing your time correctly? So I think it's good advice. It just has to go both ways.
So, what are your thoughts? Do you prefer open ended questions or close yes or no questions for interviews?
Oh, okay. So that's awesome. I've never heard an interviewing question that I can't bucket into six different kinds of questions. And it's not necessarily open ended or close ended. The first of which, like I have the good side and the bad side, three on the good, three on the bad. And while we're here discussing it, I think I will just set up the three bad ones just so that people can hear them and know that, wait a second, I shouldn't be asking these. The first of which are hypothetical questions. We coach interviewers to not ask would questions. Well, what would you do? Or if this happened, would you approach the person? We teach interviewers to think of would like a wish. You're basically asking a candidate what do you wish they would do, and that's not going to help you understand what they would actually do in your job. So avoiding would questions, avoiding leading questions. There's a second one. Leading questions can be very sneaky or very obvious. It's like, hey, you have a lot of management experience. You're probably pretty good at it, right? I sure am. That's pretty easy. There are some other sneaky leading questions that we get into more. So we have hypothetical, we have leading, and then we have non-qualifying questions. And non-qualifying questions is a really big bucket that all interviewers have to avoid. And the main reasons for that is because they're either one, not job related, or two, illegal. And they're asking you about protected characteristics and those sorts of things. So I do think that most interviewers don't go into interviews thinking, I'm going to ask legal questions today. But that's why awareness is so important. You have to at least know what questions you need to avoid, because that information is going to be something you can't make a decision off of anyway. So those are the three kinds of questions to avoid. So it's not really open-ended or close-ended. It's just those are the ones that aren't going to allow you to maximize your time with a candidate.
Asking those illegal questions is the easiest way to get your company sued.
Yes. Yeah. Lose credibility, lose lots of money. There's just yeah, it's costly. And when it does happen, companies are typically pretty quiet about it too. Um, it, I think they're trying to save their reputation a little bit, but all you have to do is give your interviewers a little bit of front end education, and you're going to save yourself from all that liability.
So, what's the craziest thing that you've seen someone ask in an interview?
I mean, since you asked, um, the interviewer was, I was shadowing this interview, helping this interviewer out, and I could tell that the interviewer was was trying to understand, this does this person have any fire? Like, can they get out there and just get it? And the person that he was interviewing was a little bit quieter, right? And he asked a completely unrelated question as, okay, if I were to punch you in the face right now, what would you do? And I mean, my poor heart and blood pressure was just going nuts. And it's like, this person clearly didn't have the tools that they needed to, one, identify, what do you mean by fire? Like, what do you need by, you need somebody to get in there and get to it and all these things. So he hadn't properly defined that, one. And two, he clearly wasn't prepared to ask the right questions to identify what they needed. And that's, if employers want to know how their people are at interviewing, I dare them just to sit in and see what's happening, because I guarantee you it's not what you think it is.
I got to know the end of that story. How did the candidate answer that question?
Yes. So I was on mute and far away, and the candidate just said, I would probably be pretty shocked. And so I actually jumped in and I asked the manager, can you continue on with the rest of your questioning? And then I called the candidate afterwards and had to apologize profusely, right? Oh, I mean, that was the worst of the worst. And as you can see why, that's the first one that comes to mind when you ask me a question like that, because I don't know if it gets much worse. But
That's a pretty bad one. That's definitely the worst I've ever heard. I had a client one time who would ask candidates, and these would be vice president, director, C-suite candidates, what their zodiac sign was
mm,
as a personality predictor.
mm, yeah, right. And it's so hard when you read like how, top execs for these multi-billion-dollar companies hire. It's like, people read that once and then they're like, I'm going to take that for my next interview. It's like, it's not going to help you. It's like, let's personalize it and base it on things that are actually job related. But yeah, we've heard a lot of goofy ones, and that's a pretty fascinating one too. That sign. Mm-hmm.
So, in your opinion, what's the importance of chemistry in an interview?
Chemistry between a candidate and an interviewer. Um, from an interviewer standpoint, I rate that extremely low. And the reason for that is, hopefully we've had a chance to work with these hiring managers and help them to understand that chemistry is just another way of saying your unconscious biases are at play, right? When you have chemistry with a person, it's likely that you have something in common with them, right? Whether it's where you went to school, whether it's the sports that you played, you grew up in the same area, had the same general childhood, whatever it is, or they had the same similar professional path that you had, you're immediately going to like that person more. And you could be missing out on great talent for people that are slightly different than you. So a long way of saying that, I rank chemistry at the lowest of low, which might be an unpopular opinion for some, but our hope is to give people tools to make better decisions that'll be more accurate in the end.
I love that. And so, how do you know if you are a good manager, a good interviewer, or you're not? How do you know that?
Yeah. Well, first, I will say that for whatever reason, most interviewers feel like they're really good at it. Um, and that's because they haven't been compared to any sort of metrics before, right? So it's hard to know. During that 7-year case study that I was talking about, I got a chance to track candidates um, across the country and Canada, and we got to look at all of these different metrics. And I would walk into meetings with some senior hiring managers and I would already know all the answers of how they're doing on paper, right? And I would open it up. I'm like, how do you feel about your interviewing process? And they'd be like, great, it's not broken. I'm like, okay. And then I'd roll out the data and say, listen, you have the highest percentage of candidates withdrawing from your interview process out of any other senior leader in this company. They don't know, right? So it's really hard for people to know if you're not brave enough to peek behind the curtain to see what this interview process management data actually looks like. A lot of companies don't track it. And if they do, they may not want to look at it. Um, but it's something I strongly encourage. If you can figure out what's broken and where the symptoms are, then you can get to the root cause and figure out what's actually going on and how can we improve this.
I love that you brought that up because you are so right. Every hiring manager I've ever worked with thinks they're great at hiring.
Yeah, right. Where do
And
you
that
think
could be
that comes
farther from.
from?
That's a great question. I think that they get promoted into a manager or director level role, and with that new title comes the assumption that they have the skills to interview and hire appropriately,
Yeah,
and that could be farther from the truth.
right. Right. Yeah. And that's not to take anything away from them being a manager, because maybe they're fantastic at their job and managing people, but that doesn't mean that they have all the skills of something they've never practiced before.
So, as we wrap up, how can our listeners find you?
Yeah, we are on Instagram and TikTok, and it's at expert interviewers. And we're on LinkedIn as well. We have a expert interviewers page in my personal account, Lorna Erickson. And I have to do a quick plug for my partner, Victoria Gates, who is our social media prowess. Without her, our accounts wouldn't be where they are. And honestly, that was what helped us to make the jump from corporate into our own company of expert interviewers, because she knew that what we were doing was working and helping companies. And she's like, let's put it out there and see if it's going to resonate with other people. And it did. By growing our Instagram and TikTok account, it gave us the confidence to know that people also need this information. So that's my quick plug for my partner, too, who's been just a massive part in our success and how we were able to build this.
Thanks, Lorna.
Thank you.